Hello and welcome to Hot and Heavy, the Elaine podcast. I'm your host, Shivani Desai. Today I'll be talking about Season 7, Episode 22, The Invitations. Hello everyone, welcome to the last episode of Season 7. What? I cannot believe I have covered 7 seasons of Seinfeld on this podcast. It's pretty amazing. I mean, every week I get excited to explore a new episode and talk about Elaine. And it's just amazing how this podcast has really helped me mentally, if I'm being honest. It's my creative outlet, in a career that I've chosen, but isn't always very consistent. The frequency with which I can express myself isn't as abundant as I'd like it to be. My dream is to star on a sitcom and have a solid every single day creative extravaganza, but it's not here yet. I'm manifesting it though. It's going to happen someday. But yeah, this podcast has been amazing for me. Such a great experience. Thank you everyone out there who has listened and subscribed and given me feedback. And it's just been such a gift. So, wow. Last episode of Season 7. I cannot believe we're here, and I can believe we're here, and I'm proud that we're here, and I'm excited to keep going. Now, this episode, it's a pretty famous episode, obviously. This is where Susan dies. Such a polarizing episode as well. I'll get more into that later, but just as we gear up to get going on all the nitty-gritty details about the episode, I just can't help but mention, wow, at the time, this was a big deal. Seinfeld was the number one show at this time. So the season finales, because there weren't 8,000 channels or streaming services that people could watch, network TV was the thing and everyone was into it. So it was a big deal. And this episode for sure rubbed people the wrong way, but I'll get more into that a little later. Just some banter for this week. I was going to say, I remember when I put this on my list of things to talk about, I was going to be like, oh, I'm a little embarrassed to say this or admit this, but I'm not embarrassed. I have gotten into the Who the Fuck Did I Marry playlist on TikTok. Now, if you're not familiar with what that is, it's a woman from Atlanta who has recorded video after video, made it into a playlist, which I didn't even know you could do on TikTok. Hashtag old. Hashtag, I say hashtag. So I'm really old. Anyway, she tells the heartbreaking and unbelievable and incredibly entertaining story about this pathological liar who she married. And I'm not going to give anything away, but all you have to do on TikTok is search up Who the Fuck Did I Marry or Who TF Did I Marry. You don't have to put the bad word in the search bar, even though I'm sure it'll still come up. You have to start at the beginning. She keeps reminding people. Some people, I'm like, who starts at part 34 and then has the audacity to ask all these questions in the comments? It's like, dude, it's part 34. Obviously you missed a lot of details. Sorry, I'm just venting, but you have to start at the beginning, the introduction video. It's an introduction disclaimer video, and then just go from there. If you just, on your TikTok account, if you just subscribe to the playlist, it'll keep going. But anyway, oh my goodness. I did actually finish it today because I could not stop watching it. I mean, she is, first of all, what she goes through, there's nothing really funny about it at all. I think it's really important for people to watch in order to hear someone tell them, because I'm sure there are so many people out there who need to hear, if you don't feel like something's right, look into it, question it, trust your gut, don't ignore the red flags, like all of these things. And this can go for any relationship. It doesn't have to be a romantic one, but it's a real lesson in what a pathological liar is capable of. And I have to say, she goes by the handle Risa Tisa, which is adorable. And she's adorable. I love her. She has a way with telling this story. It's engaging. She is so open and vulnerable, admits when, things don't make her look good either. And she's just so open and honest. And for anyone out there who knows me, that is like my number one requirement in allowing you into my life, friendship, relationship, anything. You need to be genuine and you need to present yourself how you are, good, bad, or ugly. I will take an asshole who's genuine over a really nice person who I can tell is just putting on an act. So anyway, Who the Fuck Did I Marry on TikTok. I highly recommend it. I finished it today. I'm a little bummed because it really made my time on the treadmill fly by. But yes, I fully got into that. It was a little bit, I started out as like, oh my God, it's a guilty pleasure. I'm embarrassed I'm watching this, to hell no. Everyone needs to watch this. Everyone needs to give Risa Tisa some credit for putting an incredibly painful story out there in order to help people. Now, I know cynical people will be like, oh, she just wants the attention and blah, blah, blah. It's like, she's very unassuming, honestly. She's just so genuine. Back to my my other point. She's a genuine person who's putting out a really difficult story. And she admits, part of it is catharsis. She wants to be able to unburden herself from this, what she describes as a really embarrassing period of her life, because it certainly doesn't make her look good in some instances. But she's like, if I can inspire anyone out there, even one person, to follow their gut, because they're just not sure about this person in their life. And there's been red flags and they've been burying it and they've been ignoring things and they don't want to question things. She's like, if I can inspire just one person to get out of a relationship with someone who is being dishonest and manipulating them, then it's worth it. So I believe Risa Tisa. I love Risa Tisa. And I highly recommend Who the Fuck Did I Marry? And I just realized, I'm embarrassed that I just realized that we're talking about wedding invitations in this podcast episode. And perhaps Susan would have had a Who the Fuck Did I Marry podcast if she actually survived to marry George, because George is a master liar. Pathological, probably not. Again, listen to the TikTok playlist. You'll understand the degree of lying I'm talking about. But anyway, let's get into this episode. The synopsis for the invitations is as follows. Kramer and Elaine are cut out of George's wedding by Susan. Jerry has second thoughts after suddenly getting engaged to a woman with a personality very similar to his own. Susan dies after licking the toxic glue on the several hundred wedding invitation envelopes that George bought at a discount. Kramer argues that he's entitled to $100 after not being greeted properly at the bank. This episode was written by Larry David. I also want to note this is Larry David's last episode, so he leaves the show after season 7, but he does return for the series finale. All right, we start out in the stationery store. George and Susan are there to pick out their wedding invitations, and George could not be less enthused about it. When the woman's like, "Oh, congratulations!" He's like, "Yeah, thank you." You can just tell he's miserable. So she brings out the sample book of invitations arranged by price and tells them that the most expensive invitations are in the front. So George turns the book all the way to the back page. What about this one? The woman says, I'm not sure they make those anymore, but we might have a couple boxes in our warehouse in New Jersey. I'd have to check. And Susan's like, oh God, no, we don't want those. They're so ugly. George is like, what's the difference? We mail them out and they send it right back. And Susan asks, well, why don't they make them anymore? The woman tells them there's a problem with the adhesive. It takes a lot of moisture to seal the envelopes. And George is like, so what? We'll pick up some Elmas. I love that, which they clearly didn't pick up any Elmas. So Susan agrees. You see what I do for you? The actress in this scene who plays the stationery store attendant is Sue Goodman, and she's also appeared in NYPD Blue, Liar Liar, and The Nanny. And I think she's great. This is a fun little role. It's not like it's totally flat, but she gets to, play this really bubbly stationery store person who's excited for them. So I think it's perfect casting, especially to play off George's vibe in the scene. All right, next we are on the street. George and Susan are getting a cab. Kramer walks up and greets them, and he calls Susan Lily. She's like, it's Susan. And no, he insists that her name is Lily, even after she corrects him. She's like, I think I know my own name. And George confirms meekly, it's Susan. Well, you look like a lily, Kramer says. This is reminiscent. If you guys have listened to all the episodes, you will remember how I had something very similar happen to me in the yoga studio a few weeks ago, where I introduced myself to a gentleman in the studio, and he literally asked me, it's not Giovanni, and you go by Shivani? Yeah, no, my man, I don't do that. All right, next we are in Jerry's apartment. George enters just distraught. He's like, it's coming, Jerry, it's coming. Says, we got the wedding invitations today. There's no stopping it now. Can I do this? I can't do this. He starts freaking out and he pleads with Jerry, help me. And Jerry's like, just break it off with her. He says, no, I can't face that scene. I'd rather be unhappy for the rest of my life than to go through that scene. He can't. Then he thinks about, maybe I'll write her a letter. I'll go to China and then disappear for 6 months to a year. And he thinks, okay, what would I write? Dear Susan, I'm sorry. I made a terrible mistake. I'm really, really sorry. Jerry's like, that's it? And they both agree it seems a little short. Jerry points out, you can't go to China because of your job. Oh, yeah. He says, well, maybe disappear to another borough like Staten Island. Well, George likes this, but what about his clothes? He's like, you're going to have to leave your clothes behind. Well, I'm not starting up a whole new wardrobe now. And George, still coming up with ideas. George is like, if she'd only take a plane somewhere. What, and hope for a crash? And Jerry's like, the odds of a crash are 1,000,000 to 1. Well, it's possible. It's hope, George says. Elaine enters and she sees George. Hey, George, you know what I realized? The wedding is a month away. Jerry's like, Elaine. But then she asks when she's going to be included in the wedding party. Jerry's the best man. Kramer's an usher. George is like, I don't think you're anything. Well, I have to be something. I'm a close friend. Well, what about a bridesmaid? Well, those are Susan's friends. Okay, what about an usher? George is like, fine, I'll ask. She gets in his face. You don't ask, you tell. George goes back to the letter idea, and Jerry asks Elaine, if you wanted a guy to end things with you, what should he do? And she knows right away. Start smoking. George perks up. Yes, she hates cigarettes. But you don't smoke. No. George's wheels are turning. All right, my take on this scene. Now, I'm just going to cover the scene after Elaine arrives. I love the energy she brings with her into the apartment, just how bold she is to ask to be in the wedding party. That's usually something I think you don't really, it's a touchy subject, I think, if you haven't been asked a month before, probably not going to be in the wedding party. But I just like that she's like, yeah, when am I going to be in it? Come on, this makes no sense. And then how forceful she is with George about telling, not asking. As Greg brought up in Greg's Sack Lunch a couple weeks ago, I think it was last week, she's always on the verge of beating George up. It does not take much. She's right there all the time on the edge, no matter what. I wanted to point out what I've always thought was kind of weird. There's that kind of close-up of George, and it looks like they zoomed in on George from afar because it's a little fuzzy, a little blurry when Jerry is asking Elaine, hey, if a guy wanted to end things with you. And George looks kind of scared, oh God, he looks kind of scared of Elaine in that moment. And I don't know what that means. Are we to think George doesn't want Elaine to know that he wants to end things? Maybe she'll disapprove. At any rate, there's no answers to these questions. It looks like that's the intention. Oh man, Elaine's going to yell at me or something. It's just kind of odd. And if you've noticed that, please let me know what you guys think. And speaking of odd, everything involving Elaine in this episode is pretty odd. And I'll get more into that later. But suffice it to say, all the odd things is why Elaine gets no storyline in this episode. Damn it. So the reason for that is that all of her scenes have pretty much gotten cut. The plot for Elaine, as it stands, as it was aired, is basically just her being upset that she's not included in the wedding party. So there's more to come about that later in the episode. See, I'm trying to hook you. I've learned this from Risa Tisa. There's so many instances in Who the Fuck Did I Marry where she's like, remember this. I'm going to come back to this later. And you're like, oh my God, I can't wait till she comes back to it later. Okay, enough about Risa Tisa. Okay, so anyway, a lot of Elaine's scenes got cut, and I'll get more into that later. But to talk about this scene, I like JLD's performance in this scene. I mean, I have to. She's not in the episode very much. So I pretty much, you can rest assured, I like everything she does in this episode for the minute amount of minutes she's in this episode. And I still love the hair. Love the straightened hair. All right, next we are on the street. Jerry and Elaine are walking together, and Jerry says he's starting to get a little depressed about George's wedding. Yeah, he's going to get married. She'll get pregnant. They'll probably move to Westchester, and he'll never see him again. And he says to Elaine, it'll just be the three of us. Elaine's like, no way. I'm getting out. I'm sick of being single. So it'll just be me and Kramer? Yep, she says, and she exits to her apartment. Jerry keeps walking, and then we see this kind of dream sequence with an older Jerry and an older Kramer in Jerry's apartment. Kramer comes in with this idea of a periscope in the car. Jerry hates the idea, and he tells Kramer, it's stupid. I just want to note that Kramer has a mullet in this dream sequence, and given the resurgence of mullets, he would very much be in style today in 2024. I just thought that was very accurate by accident, I'm sure. So we're back to Jerry walking on the street, kind of repeating to himself, it's stupid. He walks onto the road where he almost gets hit by a car, but he's saved by a woman pulling him back to the sidewalk. She asks if he's okay, and he says, yeah, you saved my life. Shouldn't there be some kind of reward for that? She tells him he should be more careful or he could die if that bothers you. And then she points out the tragedy of the shirt under his sweater. It sits in a drawer for 3 weeks to come out, and when it does, only sticks out an inch from your collar. Jerry introduces himself, and she does the same. Her name is Jeannie Steinman. Hey, same initials. How do you like that? And she says, I like it. The actress in this scene, as many of you know, is Janeane Garofalo. She has been a stand-up for many years, and she got her start on the Ben Stiller Show. She's known for Reality Bites, The West Wing, among a lot of voiceover work. In fact, she's the voice of Colette in Ratatouille. That blew my mind. I remember, I love the movie Ratatouille. It's so good. And I remember, I always do this. I think a lot of us do. We go to IMDb. I'm like, especially for animated stuff, I'm like, who's doing this voice? It sounds familiar. You could have given me 500 guesses. I would have never guessed that Janeane Garofalo could do such a spot-on French accent. Anyway, she's Colette in Ratatouille, and looks like she's done a lot more voiceover work, also other work, but I'm just noting that. And I think she's absolutely perfect in this role. I mean, she is cute. She's believably Jerry-esque. I'm not sure she's acting too much, because I think if you know anything about Janeane Garofalo's style or cadence of speaking, it's pretty close to what she is here as Jeannie Steinman. So yeah, I think this is absolutely perfect casting. I'm still a fan to this day. My take on this scene, Elaine's only at the very top. She barely says anything. But I did want to comment a little bit, like when she says, no, I'm getting out. I'm sick of being single. Like, what exactly does that mean? Is she just planning on getting married, or like no matter what? Which, holy shit, brings me back to Who the Fuck Did I Marry? Damn it. I swear, I don't mean to keep talking about it, but all this stuff is reminding me of it. So Risa Tisa, she was just really desperate to get married. Okay, anyway, I said I wouldn't give anything away. Just watch it. Watch it on TikTok. Trust me. Or does she mean she's going to move out of the city? Like, I just wish we got a little bit more there, which is basically the theme of everything about Elaine in this episode. I'm sorry, I'm going to harp on this, but it is criminal how little she is in this episode. All right, next we are at George's place. George asks Susan about Elaine being an usher. Susan takes a beat and she says, no, I don't want any women ushers at my wedding. And then she says that Kramer can't be an usher either. George is like, why not? He doesn't even know my name. Oh, that was an honest mistake. She says, no. He's too weird. He'll fall or something and ruin the ceremony. George says, yeah, you're probably right, while taking out a pack of cigarettes and a lighter. Susan's so confused. What are you doing? And he lights the cigarette, and she says, since when do you smoke? He says, I've always smoked. I've never seen you smoke. And he's coughing and coughing. Oh, yeah, big smoker. Well, Susan says, well, I don't like this one bit. Well, I can't stop now. George is basically choking. I'm addicted. They got a hold on me. His face is beet red. He can barely talk. She says, well, you're going to have to quit. And George is like, oh my God. And he runs to the back. Now, I was hoping there would be some insight into this, because Jason Alexander is flawless in this scene. He's so good. I really question whether or not he is legitimately choking on this smoke. Like, he is so good. And I wanted to know, how many takes of this scene did they have to do where he's choking on the cigarette? Like, that takes a toll on you, and the commitment, and it's so convincing. I don't know. I really think that he was choking on that smoke. Next, we're in Monk's. Jeannie and Jerry are there, and the waitress takes Jerry's order. He says the usual. And she asks Jeannie, and she says, bowl of Cheerios, not too much milk? Great. The waitress says 2 bowls of Cheerios. Jerry and Janine are shocked. You too? Yeah. Now, for those sticklers out there, I'm not going over who this waitress is, the actress who plays her, because I've already gone over who she is a few seasons ago. So this is the same actress who plays the receptionist at NBC when Jerry and George are going in there for the pilot. So don't come at me. I'm not ignoring this woman, but I think she's fine as this waitress as well. There you go. All right, next we are in Jerry's apartment. Jerry's on the couch, just laying there staring at the ceiling, sort of in a daze. Kramer enters and tells him that the bank on the corner is offering $100 to anyone who goes in there and doesn't get greeted with a hello. Oh, really? That's nice, Jerry says, all distracted. Now, what's with you? He says to Kramer, I think I'm in love. Kramer is skeptical. Oh, come on. No, it's true. He tells him about the woman who saved his life, and we talked, and the whole thing seemed like a dream. And Kramer's like, okay, it's because she saved your life. The same thing would happen if a guy saved your life. He says, no, this is different. She's just like me. She talks like me, acts like me, even orders cereal in a restaurant, and has the same initials. Wait a minute. Jerry realizes he's been looking for himself to come along all these years, and now I've swept myself off my feet. And Kramer is really getting freaked out. All right, next we're at the bank. Kramer goes up to a teller who greets him with a hey. Kramer gets so excited. That wasn't hello, $100. No, the teller says he did say hello, and that hey is hello. Nope, Kramer says the ad says hello. You're taking that too literally. Now, sir, do you have any business to transact? Well, I'd like to speak with the manager, Kramer says. Well, he's not here right now. I'll be back. All right, next we're in Jerry's apartment. George and Elaine are walking to Jerry's door, and Elaine is so upset. She just heard the news that she's not going to be anything in the wedding. I mean, even Kramer's an usher. And Kramer enters the hallway, and George breaks the news to him that, well, you're not an usher either. What? Well, you called her by the wrong name. But she really looks like a lily. They enter Jerry's apartment. Elaine tells Jerry that Susan won't let her be an usher. Jerry could care less and tells George he wants to bring a date to the wedding. I just met her. She's incredible. Oh, this is great, Elaine says. So now I have to sit at the singles table with all the losers? Jerry suggests going with Kramer. He says, no. Weddings are great places to meet chicks. I need to be unfettered. George is so pissed. Do you see what this is turning into? Do I need this? I've got to get out of this thing. Did you try the cigarettes? Yes, they made me sick, he tells Elaine. Kramer then gets down to business and gives him some advice. You really want to get out of this thing? I've got 2 words for you. Prenup. What does that do? George asks. He says that most women are so offended that they back out of the marriage. He looks at Elaine. She says, I wouldn't sign one. A prenup. Kramer, get out of here. All right, my take on this scene, it's a really fun scene. Elaine being upset is so understandable. I love the delivery when she says, all the losers. Now, even though it doesn't work out because Kramer needs to be unfettered, would Elaine go with Kramer as her date? I mean, she does seem to consider it for like a split second before he rebuffs her. But anyway, I was just kind of like, I can't imagine that would happen. I've said it before, but the scenes with all four of them kind of working together towards something, they're just the best. And so then I wanted to talk about George falling for this idea is pretty hilarious, considering we've seen how rich the Rosses are. We've seen the brownstone. Like, Susan comes from money. But I think, George is just so tunnel visioned here to blow up this relationship. He's like, yeah, I'll ask her for a prenup. That's going to work. And I also think the confirmation from Elaine is a great touch. She is the only one who could confirm in this group that this is a viable idea. So I just like that little moment between them. Now, if anything, the opposite should be true. Susan should have him sign a prenup, given how much money her family has. And she was also an executive. Now, since they've gotten back together, they've never specified what Susan does for a living. And it actually kind of bothered me. In the Notes About Nothing a couple episodes ago, they say that she's been unemployed this whole time. I'm like, that doesn't seem right. I mean, she had her own apartment and all that stuff. I'm like, no. In my head, I'm just making up that Susan is some executive at maybe like CBS or ABC, not at NBC anymore, but she's still in TV and she's got a kick-ass job. That's just my backstory for her. But yeah, if anything, she needs to make George sign a prenup, like seriously sign one. And we will see how this whole prenup thing blows up in his face in a couple of scenes. All right, next we're in George's apartment. George enters and Susan is working on the seating chart and asks, what about the Drakes? And he says, you got to invite the Drake. A callback to the handicap spot. Hate the Drake, love the Drake. George tells her, there's something that's on his mind and he really wants to talk to her about it. So she asks, what's up? He tells her that he'd like her to sign a prenuptial agreement. Susan clarifies, a prenup? Yeah. She busts out laughing. She says, you don't have any money. I make more money than you do. Sure, give me the papers. I'll sign them. And she repeats it, a prenup. And we just hear her cackling in the background while George is just like, oh, fuck. Like the look on his face and the cackling of Susan in the background. Oh, such a funny scene. So much so, I need to give a shout out to Heidi Swedberg here. Swedberg. I'm going with Swedberg. She's so fantastic in this scene. That cackling laugh and just the sheer ridiculousness of his request. It's pitch perfect. Everything about her performance in this scene works for me. That delivery about giving her the papers. Sure, give me the papers. I'll sign them. I love it. I laugh every single time. As I've said before, I am a huge Heidi Swedberg fan, totally in her court. I know people love to hate her. I will stand by Heidi Swedberg and her performance as Susan. All right, next we have a Jerry and Jeannie romantic montage. We see them walking in the park, stepping over a sleeping homeless man. We see them in the cereal aisle discussing cereal. At a newsstand, she's reading Supergirl, he's reading Superman. And then they're making out in his apartment, and Kramer tries to enter, but the door is locked. Jerry has to let Kramer in, and Kramer's a little cold to Jeannie. He tells Jerry about the whole hey incident at the bank. And Jerry's like, oh, hey is hello. Jeannie, what do you think? And she agrees. Oh, big surprise, Kramer says. All right, next we're at George's apartment. The invitations get delivered and Susan receives them and says, oh, these are so cheap. George is on his way out and she reminds him that they're going ring shopping tomorrow. And this time we're not skimping. All right, next we are in Jerry's apartment. Kramer asks, oh, did Jeannie leave? And he says, yeah, but she's coming to see my act tonight. Kramer's like, oh, I'm sure that'll be right up her alley. So Jerry senses an attitude. Is there something on your mind? Finally, Kramer admits, I don't like her. Never liked her from the get-go. He says, everything she thinks you think. Everything you think she thinks. It's too much. Well, Jerry's offended. If you can't take her, maybe you can't take me. So that's how it's going to be, huh? That's how it's going to be. Well, God help us. All right, so I'm going to do something a little different. I'm going to kind of pause here and talk about the Elaine deleted scenes that I think were supposed to take place around this time in the episode. So basically, George is at his office, so that's where he's leaving to go when Susan shouts after him, like, we're going ring shopping tomorrow, blah, blah, blah. So he's in his office and Elaine enters and she's very serious. And she says, George, I wanted to tell you this in person, but I'm not going to the wedding. And he's like, why not? She says, I'm not in the wedding and I don't want to sit at the singles table. Well, the actual George Steinbrenner walks by and hears this. So obviously everyone out there knows, I'm sure no one's listening to this who has never watched Seinfeld before, but so up until this point, obviously we've seen the actor Lee Baer from behind. We hear Larry David's voice as the voice of Steinbrenner. So like that's how we've established George Steinbrenner in this show. But apparently George Steinbrenner happened to be in LA for something. And so they asked him, hey, would you want to film some scenes for our finale? And so anyway, he comes into the scene and he's appalled about this whole sitting at the singles table thing. And he, in a very George Steinbrenner way, starts kind of unloading on Elaine. He's like, we're Yankees. We don't sit at the singles table. Singles tables are for losers. You shouldn't sit at the singles table. I'll tell you what, I'll go to the wedding with you. So that way we'll be together and there's no singles table. And he tells Elaine, you're going to go with me. Now you lose a little weight, get yourself together, and we'll go together. And then he tells George, now either she goes with me or you're out of here, George. So of course, George is like, yeah, of course she's going to go with you. And Elaine's like horrified, like, what? And then there's a scene that they filmed with, I don't know how this came about, but apparently it was agreed that they were going to go on a date together. So it's literally Elaine and George Steinbrenner at a restaurant, kind of on this date. So first we see Elaine facing him and it's the real George Steinbrenner, but we see the back of him like we've had before, except that's really Steinbrenner. Anyway, so he's doing kind of like the motions that we've seen before, but I don't know, just rambling on. And then he asks her for no conceivable reason. I'm telling you, all of this is in the deleted scenes. It's pretty bad. So at some point he asks if they can switch seats. So she's like, yeah, that's fine. And Elaine is so not interested. She's very bored. She's kind of like humoring him. So they switch seats. So then we see the back of Elaine and George Steinbrenner facing her. And then I don't know why they decided this was a good idea. She's basically doing a George Steinbrenner impression from the back. She's got this voice and she's doing this and she's like pointing and doing all the physical stuff. And then the story is something like, one time I lost my shoes on a plane. They were pretty good shoes. They were suede. Did you ever rub your hand against the fabric on suede? Blah, blah, blah. Like it's so bad. So she's like, well, it was bye-bye shoes because I couldn't find my shoes. But then I walked through the airport barefoot. I'm telling you, I'm never wearing shoes again. Bye-bye shoes. Bye-bye shoes. And it was like, this is Elaine I'm talking about. This is Elaine doing this in George Steinbrenner voice and cadence and movements. So Elaine would have been in the episode a lot more had they not cut out those scenes. So while I do want more Elaine in this episode, she gets so cheated in this episode, they needed to cut these scenes. Holy shit. So Andy Ackerman, who is the director of this episode, said, you know, first of all, they kind of alluded to the fact that like George Steinbrenner, he just didn't perform. I didn't think he was like terrible, but he's not an actor. So he comes off very, very stiff. And then also, apparently he had trouble with the script. Like he didn't like the whole, he's like, yeah, you know, he was interviewed in the Inside Look and he said, I didn't like how they killed off that girl because she was licking the envelopes. I didn't like that, you know? So maybe he had some objections, but I think they had already made the decision. The whole way we've presented Steinbrenner is just kind of blown out of the water now. Like we can't have both worlds. So they made the decision to cut out these scenes, which I think in the long run was a very, very good decision. However, it does result in JLD literally having no storyline in this episode. So it sucks in that regard, but those scenes needed to go. Holy shit. If you guys have the DVDs, I don't know, maybe you can even Google it. I've never looked, but the deleted scenes with Elaine and Steinbrenner, I mean, it's just like, I can't stress how terrible they are. All right, moving on. There's a few like quick scenes. First, we see Susan. She's working on the invitations. She licks the first envelope and makes a face. Ugh, that's awful, she says. Then we cut to Jerry on a bench by the ocean, just thinking about life, looking around and seeing all the happy couples around him. Now, these are the exact same scenes we see George looking at in the engagement episode, which is the first episode of this season. So same thing again. Jerry runs through all the birds, the seagulls or whatever on the boardwalk. Then we're back to Susan, and she's not looking too good. She's all sweaty, kind of looking weak, licking those envelopes. All right, next we're at the bank. Kramer sits with the manager of the bank and tells him about the no hello. He says, well, you're entitled to $100. That's our policy. And Kramer's like, yeah, but the teller wouldn't give it to me. So the manager calls the teller over. He says, can you give me a minute? So then there's this awkward silence. And then Kramer tries to make some small talk. He asks about the desk. Yeah, it's nice. Is this oak? I think it's pine. Yeah, pine's good. Yeah, pine's okay. Now, I think a lot of you know, this is Stephen Root. Oh my God. One of the best actors out there, in my opinion. He's so amazing. If you guys haven't watched Barry, you need to watch that. I mean, anything Stephen Root is in. I mean, he plays Milton in Office Space. Like he is such a chameleon too. Like, I mean, he looks different in every role he plays basically, and holds a special place in my heart. My dad loved him as an actor. My dad used to watch, God, what was he in? Was it News Radio? Or he was in some sitcom. Forgive me. I don't remember what sitcom it was, but my dad absolutely loved him. He thought he was such a great actor. So Stephen Root holds a special place in my heart. And even in this small scene, he's very memorable. I love his whole vibe in this scene. So anyway, after they go over what the desk is made of, the teller comes over and the manager explains what Kramer told him. The teller says, no, I said, hey, like a friendly greeting. Hey. Kramer argues, yeah, but that's not hello. The manager says, well, that's a tough one. He calls over some other bank employees, and they all arrive greeting in different ways. How you doing? What's happening? What's up? Asks Kramer to excuse them for a minute. So when Kramer kind of walks away from the desk, another employee walks by and says, how's it going? It's so simple, but this stuff cracks me up. I love that like every employee does not say hello, but greets him in a different way. Anyway, they have their little discussion, and he calls Kramer back, says, you got a greeting that begins with an H. How's $20 sound? And Kramer says, I'll take it. All right, sir. They shake hands. Again, I love the whole vibe of that scene. It's very fun. All right, next we're at the comedy club and also some quick scenes interjected. Jerry enters the club in a daze and approaches Jeannie, who's sitting at one of the tables in the bar area, and he just asks her to marry him. Then we cut to Susan. Now she's super pale. Her lips are all dry. She's licking the envelopes. Then her eyes roll back and she keels over. On the street, we see George walking around just despondent. He just looks so helpless. Back to the comedy club, everyone is toasting Jerry and Jeannie's engagement. George enters and Jerry is so happy to see him and tells him he's getting married September 21st, first day of autumn, leaves changing, beautiful colors. Jeannie chimes in, all that crap. Jerry says, you see, I kept up my end of the pact. Yeah, good for you, George says. And he hands him some champagne. To our future wives. Then we cut to George entering the apartment. He sort of glances over to where Susan is and then stops and looks back. All right, next we're in Monk's. Jerry and Jeannie sit at a booth and he says, I could use some coffee. Jeannie kind of starts in on a bit about decaf, very Jerry-esque. Then a guy falls super hard right in front of their booth and she says, that's a shame. The waitress comes over and she orders cereal again. And Jerry's surprised again and points out that she had it for breakfast and lunch. And she says, well, speaking of that, what's the deal with brunch? And why is there not a linner or lupper? She's given a lot of Jerry bits to him. And Jerry just stares at her. Next, we're in Jerry's apartment. Kramer enters and he says he just heard the news about the engagement and he congratulates Jerry. He also apologizes. He says he'll learn to like Jeannie. Jerry's lying on the couch and is looking really worried. Oh, what's wrong? Jerry says, I think I may have made a big mistake. And Jerry says, I can't be with someone like me. I hate myself. I need someone the opposite of me. It's too much, Kramer. I can't take it. Well, too bad you got engaged, he says. Yeah, too bad. And then Jerry gets a call from George and he's like, what? Really? He says, okay, I'll call Elaine and we'll meet you there. He hangs up and tells Kramer that they just took Susan to the hospital. All right, next we're in the hospital. So all four of them are there and Jerry says to George, so she was just lying there? George is like, yeah. Elaine wonders what happened. I don't know, George says. And then George sees a doctor and goes over to him. The doctor says, I'm sorry. She's gone. What's that? She's expired. Are you sure? Yes, of course, the doctor says. So she's dead? Yes. The doctor asks if she was exposed to any kind of inexpensive glue. George looks over. Why? He says that in her system they found a toxic adhesive from low-priced envelopes. George tells him about the wedding invitations. Oh, that's probably what did it. Yeah, we were expecting about 200 people. He shakes the doctor's hand and thanks him. He goes back to the group and tells them she's gone. Jerry clarifies, dead? Elaine says, I'm so sorry, George. Yeah, me too, Jerry says. Kramer says, poor Lily. They all correct him, Susan. How did this happen? He says, apparently the glue on the envelopes were toxic. Oh, well, that's weird. So I guess you're not getting married. And George can barely contain his excitement. He just is like, yeah. But Jerry starts, what? Well, now I'm engaged. Yeah. Well, I thought we both would be getting married. Hey, George says, what can I tell you? Elaine's ready to go. She's like, all right. George suggests that they all get some coffee. Jerry yells after them, we had a pact. The tag of this episode is George calling Marissa Tomei. He reminds her who he is and tells her, I'm not engaged anymore. Well, she died. A toxic glue from the invitations. Anyway, I've got the funeral tomorrow, but my weekend is pretty wide open. Hello? Of course, Marissa Tomei has hung up on him. My take on this scene. Yeah, so this is the scene that did it. Made people really upset. And I remember back in 1996, 17-year-old me, I remember being very surprised and a little confused about how I felt about it. And then there was like bad press. I remember it was like on the Today Show or Good Morning America the next morning. People were kind of like all mad about it, like so insensitive. What an insensitive thing for this show to do. So it did sway me a little bit. I'll admit. I thought the show had gone too far at that time. But now when I watch this scene, it's incredible. It's so good. I mean, this is who these people are. They are cold. They are heartless. And also, there was no way George could go through with getting married. The show needed an out. And I cannot think of a better way. Now I cannot think of a better way to get this done. I thought this was brilliant. And JLD's line delivery when she says how sorry she is, she's conveying here what you're supposed to say. You're supposed to say, I'm sorry, but saying it in a way that communicates, I'm not sure you're really sad about this. So I love that delivery that she gives there because it's like, I'm so sorry, George. It's like, am I? It's great. It's a question more than a statement. And that's just the perfect way to deliver all the emotions they're all feeling. Because they all know George wanted to get out of this thing desperately. He was completely stressed out. So they know he's not going to be sad, but it's also they're going up to that edge of appropriateness, which I love. And it's because these four have no souls. If there was ever a no hugging, no learning moment, this is the exemplification of that. And what better way for Larry David to go out on the sitcom he co-created with the vibe he created with the no hugging, no learning motto he came up with for the show, other than the most blatant and extreme example of the four of them doing this. I just think it's brilliant. Back in 1996, I was swayed and I was like, I don't think they should have done that. But now I'm like, yes, this was perfect. Okay, I'm going to take a quick break and I will see you on the other side. Planning a wedding is stressful, so why not ease the tension when it comes to one of the most worrisome situations at every wedding, the singles table. We all know the singles table is unavoidable. You must provide seating for your pathetic single friends who, though given the option of a +1, RSVP'd without a date. Obviously, that table will be in the far corner of the ballroom next to the exit. But how can you ensure these pitiful loose cannons won't do something to ruin your event? That's why you need the Full Fillers, a service that provides seat fillers who will keep an eye on the lonely people at your wedding. When we were going over our seating chart, I saw that our singles table was going to consist of some risky folks. A recently divorced cousin, a college friend obsessed with Disney, and 4 friends in our lives who did improv. I could foresee a lot of messiness, so I called the Full Fillers. And boy, am I glad I did. They sent some real pros who kept our relationship-challenged friends and family under control. Best money I spent for our wedding. Call the Full Fillers at 555-LOSERS and let us handle the guests who have made the cut but their love life's in a rut. For a limited time, you will receive a case of Elmer's glue to help with all of your sticking needs. The Full Fillers, because it's your special day and you don't need to see public urination of any kind. And we're back. Okay, so the extras. I've already gone over the deleted scenes with Elaine and George Steinbrenner, and I'm not going to mention it again because, good God, was it terrible. But I did want to talk about, in the inside look, Heidi Swedberg was interviewed. And this just made me happy. She was so excited that they were killing off Susan. I mean, she talks about how Larry David just happened to walk her to her car one day, and that's how he broke the news. He's like, by the way, we're killing your character off after she licked some envelopes. But she recognized that the most inappropriate things are the funniest things. And so she was all for it, really was excited about it. Jason Alexander talks about how, this was the thing that the fans turned on him for at least a little bit. He would get approached, you killed Susan. And he was like, I kind of make the argument, George didn't kill her. I mean, there was no intent. Okay, he picked out the envelopes, but he didn't mean to. It just happened to work out that way. And they all recognized that George's reaction, and the friends and Jerry, Elaine, and Kramer, the reaction to the death was so cold. And that's what really pissed people off. There was all this press is wrong. It's so rude. It's pretty dangerous for them to put that out there. But that stays true to who these people are and what the show is. So again, many years later now, 28 years later, I can appreciate it. But I at the time, I was in the camp of I don't know if they should have done that. In the notes about Nothing, they mentioned some deleted dialogue that involved Elaine and George. And I kind of like this exchange. George originally says, well, you can't be an usher. You're a woman. What are you going to wear? And Elaine replies, well, I'll wear a dress. And George says, well, that'll throw everything off. So then Elaine offers to wear a tuxedo. George replies, isn't that kind of, And Elaine warns and gets in his face. Be very careful here, George. I think this was going to be a lesbian joke or something. So I kind of like that exchange, though. Any kind of conflict with George and Elaine is so delicious every time. In more deleted dialogue, Elaine tells George to put his foot down about being an usher at his wedding, fight for her. And George just defeatedly says, I have no foot. So this is a callback to when he was dating the piano player, Noelle, and he doesn't have any hand. So I thought that was kind of cute. I wish they would have kept that in, actually. So I wanted to go over real quick. I've alluded to this whole incident that happened with Jason Alexander when he was on Howard Stern, and some really kind of shitty remarks he made about killing off Susan, and more specifically, things he said about Heidi Swedberg, the actress. So forgive me, I pulled up an article. I just have a link to it in my notes. So this is what he said on the show, quote, I couldn't figure out how to play off of her. So first of all, let me back up a little bit. So he's talking about Howard Stern brings up the whole storyline and all this stuff. And keep in mind, this is in 2015. So this is well after the show was even on the air. So when Howard brings it up, Jason Alexander doesn't hesitate to kind of divulge that the show's writers decided to kill off Susan because he and the rest of the cast did not enjoy sharing scenes with the actress who portrayed her. So this is what he says. He says, I couldn't figure out how to play off of her, Alexander said of Swedberg, who followed her 1997 departure from the celebrated NBC sitcoms with roles on Roswell, Gilmore Girls, and Bones. He goes on to say, her instincts for doing a scene where the comedy was and mine were always misfiring. And she would do something and I would go, okay, I see what she's going to do. I'm going to adjust to her. And I'd adjust and then it would change. The article goes on, Alexander said he wasn't happy when 3 episodes into Swedberg's stint on the series, co-creator Larry David informed him that George and Susan would be getting hitched. It says, later on in the show's run, with producers still unsure of whether Susan and George would go through with the wedding or what the future would be, Jerry and Julia shared a number of scenes with Swedberg and finally understood what Alexander had been grousing about. And Julia actually said, don't you just want to kill her? And Larry went, kabang! Just like that, the character's fate was sealed, so to speak. So a few days later, Jason Alexander posted a message to Twitter saying he regretted how his comments to Stern came out, as his intention for telling the story was solely to make it clear that he and the cast did not have issues with Swedberg's personality. So this is what Jason Alexander wrote on Twitter. He said, okay, folks, I feel officially awful. The impetus for telling this story was that Howard said Julia Louis-Dreyfus told me you all wanted to kill her. So I told the story to try and clarify that no one wanted to kill Heidi. Then he clarified that JLD's kill comment was about the character, not the actress. And he pointed out that Swedberg would routinely ask him if he had any suggestions for her performance. He also wrote that David and Seinfeld were pleased with how Swedberg was bringing Susan to life. He says, people clearly like the George-Susan interplay, even though I believed it was off. And he goes on to say about Heidi Swedberg that she was generous and gracious, and I'm so mad at myself for retelling this story in any way that would diminish her. He says, if I had had more maturity or more security in my own work, I surely would have taken her query and possibly tried to adjust the scenes with her. She surely offered, but I didn't have that maturity or security. I don't know. I will go as far as saying there's something about Jason Alexander's personality. Whenever I've seen him in interviews and a lot of these behind the scenes inside looks of the episode that are on the DVD extras, there's something about him. He just kind of comes off asshole-ish. Like there's no other way to put it. I think he has a really big ego. I think he's very into getting all the attention. So yeah, there's something about him where I think his apology is bullshit. It was necessary. It was well written. And I'm not even going to deny the fact that he probably did regret it. I believe that. But I also think he knew what the fuck he was doing when he's like sitting there bashing this woman who, as he revealed, like offered up like, hey, let's work on this. Like, do you have any suggestions? Like she sort of knew her place. And the bigger overarching issue that I have with this is it's all to do with status. You know, Jason Alexander, you're like a Tony Award winning actor who is on one of the biggest sitcoms of all time. You are extremely talented. Your status in the industry is way higher than Heidi Swedberg. And so I believe that when you hold that status, your words hold a lot of power. And do you need to attack a woman who has gone on to just kind of be mostly a private citizen? Yeah, you know, she was on Gilmore Girls and other shows. But for the most part, now it's very sweet. I think she actually lives in Hawaii and she teaches ukulele. Like she lives a very quiet life. She did not ask to be kind of outed as this horrible person to work with. Like I just thought it was in such poor taste for anyone, but especially someone who benefits from this show for the rest of his life. Like this man doesn't have a worry because he's been on Seinfeld. Like he's got the status, he's got the money. You know, just in bad taste, really tacky. And yeah, like I said, I think that adds to my admiration of her and her performance. She did stand out. She brought Susan to life. She's hilarious. She's a great actress, and she definitely didn't deserve to be called out that way. And then, of course, people were reaching out to Heidi Swedberg after this interview, and I just couldn't love her response more. She said, quote, I tend not to like to say unkind things about anyone, so I'll leave it at that. That's a good reason why I play the ukulele instead of working in television, end quote. I think that's a good end right there, and let's move on. And we're moving on to Greg's sack lunch. Greg is our most dedicated contributor to this podcast, and every week he sends in a sack full of his thoughts. And this week, oh, wow. Okay, so he contacted me this week and said, hey, do you mind if I provide my own Seinfeld IRL in the sack? And I was like, hell yeah. I didn't have one this week, so it's perfect. So he says, before I even start, I have a Seinfeld in real life to contribute this week. A friend of mine was in town to have some meetings, and I tagged along to an informal meeting he had at a bar with a guy he had met before, but I hadn't, obviously. Drinks turned into ordering some food, and we each got something different. When I commented on how good this guy who I didn't know's food looked, he picked up a piece of the ravioli I think was on his fork and literally put it in my face to eat. Not wanting to come off rude, I obliged and ate it. Then he did the same thing to my buddy who hesitantly ate off of this man's fork. I couldn't stop thinking about it afterward. Even if offering food to my family or friends, I would just say, try it and have them use their own fork. I wouldn't feed them like a baby. Am I crazy? I could totally imagine this happening to Jerry or Elaine or George. Okay, on with the sack, he says. Okay, so before we get on with your sack, yeah, that is weird. No, that's totally weird. You don't know him. I've done that with my husband, but it's because he's my husband and my kids. I've done that with my kids, of course, probably when they were babies and toddlers, but even now, that's an intimate thing. It's absolutely an intimate thing. I have some follow-ups. Like, was he a little tipsy? Maybe he even like afterwards he was like, did I just do that? Oh my God. Like, hopefully he had some second thoughts about it too, because it's definitely weird. Totally could see this on Seinfeld. I agree, Greg. Who would I want? I would want this to happen to Elaine, of course. Elaine. This is an Elaine podcast. Of course. I want Elaine to have everything. That would be really funny. Would it be another woman? Maybe another woman doing this. I don't want it to be a man. I want a woman to do this to Elaine and her having an issue with it. That would be really funny. Well, thank you for that Seinfeld IRL. And now let's get into Greg's overall thoughts about the episode. He says, well, we lose Susan in this episode. I never really liked how this played. Some things are just not really that funny, and to kill off a character in such a ridiculous way just fell flat with me then and does even watching it all these years later. The scene at the hospital at the end, quite frankly, sucks. I get that this is the kind of show where the characters are cold and such, but none of this is either remotely believable, and even worse, it's not funny. Oh, big old disagree, Greg. Apologize. I've already gone into it, but I think I think it was really funny. I think it's funny. I think it's so at its core what Seinfeld is. I'm sorry, but it's just extra poetic for me that Larry David got to write his last episode killing a character and delivering it in the most Larry David way. And, you know, as we know, George is Larry David. And so this is how he would react. I mean, it's so honest. Back to my emphasis on people being genuine. I mean, I understand what you mean. It's not believable. But I think in the universe they have built, the lead up to this wedding, seeing George just absolutely miserable, leading up to it over and over again, wanting to get out of it, little like near misses of you know, either he ending it or Susan ending it. Like they've led up to this moment. And so when they're all so cold about it, and that's what I said earlier when Elaine almost says it as a question, I'm so sorry, George. Like, are we sorry about this? Because we know how you really feel. I respect your disdain, but I stand by what I said. I all these years later, I appreciate what they did. All right, next in Greg's sack are his favorite scenes and Elaine moments. He says, Elaine doesn't get much in this episode as it really focuses on George and Susan and then Jerry secondarily. My favorite line of hers, though, is when she says to George at the beginning about being in his wedding, you don't ask, you tell. He looks so scared of her in that moment. Oh, yes, I completely agree. Like you said, you brought it in my head, Greg, that at any moment she could beat him up. And that was very clear in that one moment. Next, Greg says, not an Elaine moment, but I love Susan's reaction when George asks her to sign the prenup. It's arguably her funniest moment in the run of the show. Oh my gosh, I completely agree. I mean, I've already gave her a shout out for it, but I mean, it's not technically her last scene in the series, but it's definitely like kind of the last hurrah. She got to do some big acting here with laughing and oh my gosh, like she got some range in this scene and she delivers it perfectly. Completely agree. Such a great performance. Yeah, give me the papers. I'll sign them. Sorry, I know I keep saying that. But as you can see, even when I do my mediocre impression of it, it still makes me laugh. All right, next in Greg's sack is his scene swap idea. He says, while the George stuff is funny, I hate that they kill off Susan. I actually like Jerry's story the best in this one, probably because I'm a fan of Janeane Garofalo and the casting of her is perfect. I'd ditch the Kramer bank story and give Elaine more. She barely has anything at all. I remember hearing that the real George Steinbrenner filmed scenes with JLD for this episode, but that he was so bad they cut it completely out. I'd have her trying to schmooze Susan so that she gets to be a bridesmaid, or I'd have her befriend Jeannie. If Jerry is Elaine's best friend, it stands to reason that she and Jeannie would get along. Not pairing them up was a missed opportunity. Oh my gosh. Well, I'm going to get to my scene swap idea or scene inclusion idea, considering she doesn't get anything. There's a lot there that overlaps with what you said. Yes, you heard correctly. Like I said before, George Steinbrenner did shoot some scenes. They kind of, I'd heard about how bad he was, but I have to say, he's not good, but I've seen worse. I guess I'll say that. And they're so diplomatic on the inside look. They were just like, we needed the episode ran long anyway. We needed to cut out like 6 or 7 minutes. So we just decided, and we'd be ruining the whole illusion with Steinbrenner that we had established, blah, 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 all to say, this didn't work. We need to cut this shit out. But unfortunately, the casualty was Elaine's scenes as well. All right, next in Greg's sack are his extra thoughts. He says, Elaine mentions that the wedding is a month away, but George and Susan just ordered the invitations. Last minute much? Oh, this has always bugged me too. I've never talked about that. I want to say the etiquette is at least 2 months. Like, you don't send invitations a month out. Definitely not. Yeah, very last minute. But you just have to believe it for the sake of the show. And lastly, Greg says, I met Janeane Garofalo just a few months ago after seeing her do stand-up and totally forgot she was even on this show. I liked her character here as she basically is the female Jerry. She was cool in person and her set was very, very funny. See her if you get the opportunity. Oh my gosh, I would love to see her. Her sense of humor is so up my alley. I would definitely do that. I got to keep an eye out for any Janeane Garofalo Denver dates. That's so cool. I think you had mentioned to me that you had met her a while ago. That's so cool. Yeah, she seems like she'd be really chill. There's something about her career that I really admire too. I think I'd heard a podcast interview with her a while back. I can't remember what show it was, but like she just has such a healthy attitude towards Hollywood. And she went through, like, I remember, if you guys have seen Reality Bites, I don't want to make this about appearance, but there's a point to it. She was, by Hollywood standards, I guess plus size. She was probably like a normal size, but especially when you're paired up next to Winona Ryder, you're going to look pretty big compared to her if you're not a completely wafy type person. But she was sort of deemed like, oh, she's like the unorthodox like actress and blah blah blah. She's not skinny and blah blah whatever. And then she was in that movie, The Truth About Cats and Dogs. And she has given interviews about this so it's basically like all that shit in the 90s where it's like, well, there's no way someone overweight or who doesn't look like fucking Uma Thurman could be at all attractive to any good looking dude. So it's basically the story about these men and women dating. She's friends. I can't remember, something with Uma Thurman's in it. So basically she's being compared to Uma Thurman in this whole film. And then by the end, somehow she miraculously loses like a ton of weight. She's super cute by the end. And I guess the moral of the story is, get hotter. So anyway, she talked about that and and this was actually the shooting of this episode. So The Truth About Cats and Dogs came out, I want to say in 1996 as well. So she had just shot that And then, so that all that weight was off of her for this, for, you know, her time on Seinfeld, which makes sense because I was like, wow, she does look really small. And anyway, she was very vocal about, of course, the double standards, you know, just the unrealistic expectations. So I love that she's always been super vocal and in favor of, let's stop doing this shit to women. Like, we don't do it to men. This is bullshit. Like, I've never tried to be the ingenue. I've never tried to be the leading lady who's hot. Like, I'm the funny one. Like, I don't give a shit. But that just comes along with the territory. You know, it's not enough that Tina Fey or Amy Poehler or Maya Rudolph are fucking hilarious and brilliant comedically. They gotta look really cute too, guys. Like, it's real bullshit. But anyway, point is, I really love Janeane Garofalo as well. Thank you so much, Greg, for providing your sack once again. We always love your thoughts. And now it's time to close Greg's sack a lunch. All right, moving on to my favorite Elaine moments. There's not much to choose from. But just like Greg, it's the you don't ask, you tell. Threatening George. That's always a great Elaine moment. And then a close second, I guess, is all the losers. I just love that delivery. And my final notes for the episode, this, like I said, an iconic episode that unfortunately sweeps Elaine to the side for reasons beyond JLD's control. She couldn't help that Steinbrenner sucked. But even if those scenes were kept in, I would have hated the Elaine plot. Seriously, would have hated it. Especially the embarrassingly bad Steinbrenner impression that they made JLD do. I'm telling you guys, like, look it up. It is so awful. It's like, where is this coming from? What is happening? Why would she do this? She wouldn't. Like, you want to talk about, like, Greg, you want to talk about unrealistic, like this Elaine morphing into a George Steinbrenner impression. Like, what the fuck? So anyway, totally right call to cut those scenes out. But again, poor JLD gets swept out with it. So my scene addition idea, instead of a swap, I would have loved, because honestly, like, Kramer's plot is so just isolated, but I still really like it. I love that scene at the bank, Stephen Root. I love it all. I mean, I know it's kind of just like, what? It's so random. I really like it. Anyway, I would have loved to see a Benestanza scheme where, so Greg, you said, oh, maybe she tries to schmooze Susan. I'm going the opposite way. I think she and George team up where Elaine helps him try and like blow up this relationship and call off the wedding because she's upset with Susan for not allowing her in the wedding party. So just somehow she helps George to end things. So that would maybe include some scenes with Elaine and Susan together. I think that would be good. Like maybe Elaine trying to plant some doubt in Susan's head. And now Susan could still die in the same way, but we would have a fun pairing with Elaine and Susan, which I always thought those scenes were great. I also thought, just like Greg, about Elaine and Jeannie having some scenes as well. Just those two actresses would be so great together. I will put a little bit more emphasis on the Benestanza plot because that will always win out. But yeah, if we could have also gotten some Elaine and Jeannie, I think that would work. Like Greg said, you know, best friend, new girlfriend or fiance, those scenes would totally work too. Okay, wow. So I think that's all I can say about the invitations. Now I'm going to take a week off, so no new Hot and Heavy next week, but please be sure to follow the podcast on social media because I will be posting another edition of my best of Elaine moments where don't get too excited. They're not spot on, but I just do my own silly impressions of every favorite Elaine moment from every episode of the season. I splice it all together and I slap it on those social media accounts. So please be sure to follow on Instagram, Hot Heavy Elaine, TikTok, Elaine Benes Podcast. And if you have any other thoughts, you really want to get in touch with me, please do at elainepodcast@gmail.com. Thank you so much for listening. On to season 8. And I will see you next time.